All right, everyone. So what I would like to talk about is a little bit following off of the last group of presentations about things that academia could do to make open source the default. And that goes for open source software and open source hardware. So I want to start off with just the good news. Our team is winning. If we look at how software is being developed, free and open source software is becoming the default within industry. Many of the top, Fortune 500 companies already use it. Open educational resources are everywhere, being integrated into more and more classes, if not being completely run off of them. Open access within academia is also becoming the default, particularly in North America. Instead of purchasing kind of open access rights with publishers, what we're doing in North America is we're setting up our own repository. So almost every university has their own version of open source scholarship, and more of the funders are encouraging or demanding that researchers start to use it. And then last but not least is open source hardware. A few years ago, it was basically unheard of, but today there's dedicated journals to it. There's an explosion of resources. I try to keep track of all, or I used to try to keep track of all the open source hardware within academia. And at this point, it's simply not possible. So what I want to talk about today is how we can make it the default, so that rather than open source being sort of the afterthought that's sort of tagged on to projects, it becomes the way that we do everything. So there is a lot of momentum in our favor. Anybody that's very serious about computing already knows this. Supercomputers, every single one of them on the planet at this point is running Linux. At the same time, it's starting to take over applications that we all have in our back pockets, our smartphones, as open source software begins to dominate in that sphere as well. And if we track this out into the future, we've never had good inroads into the desktop market, but mobile and tablets are certainly doing well. And the Internet of Things is also already dominated by open source. And we heard from the last presenter talking a little bit about how to commercialize open source. And so on the hardware side, Tesla did a very interesting example where they purposely open sourced their hardware for the purpose of becoming a platform. So if I want to start up any kind of company associated with electric cars right now, it's very likely that I'm going to use one of the open source platforms, and Tesla got there first. And this absolutely can lead to money, as we saw with, I don't know if Elon Musk is still the richest person in the world, but he's very wealthy no matter how you look at it. Within academia, we're starting to take open source quite seriously as well. So this is a log plot of looking up the terms open source software and open source hardware on Google Scholar. And as you can see, the top line is for software, and it has had exponential growth, and it's now, I don't want to say it's saturated, but if there's tens of thousands of articles that come out on open source software, use open source software every year. Most of the people that are writing about code are publishing open source software. The interesting fact is that open source hardware is roughly 15 years behind and on that same exponential growth curve. And so in the olden days, the thought was you couldn't even have open hardware because, you had to actually physically build things. But now with distributed manufacturing technologies, software and hardware are really becoming synonymous with each other. And so how open source software or open source hardware is kind of playing out in academia is through distributed manufacturing. So you have one scientist design something for herself. And rather than just manufacture it and use it in her own lab, if she shares it with the rest of the community, with an open source license, so that anybody that makes a derivative from it is obligated to reshare it with the community, then we get more and more complex things. So this kind of cartoon that I did in this somewhat now dated book is actually happened in real life. And so it started off with a simple little tube, and now there are dozens of types of centrifuges built around that tube. So if the original person that put the tube up or any of the original test tubes needs a centrifuge, it's freely available. The one in the upper left is the Dremel-fuge. This was one of my favorites. It's just a chuck that you attach to a Dremel drill that costs maybe 50 or 60 bucks. And now you can build yourself an ultra centrifuge on the cheap in the middle of nowhere. Some of the ones on the right are, that could be integrated into any lab. And the one in the middle shows how far we can go with distributed technologies for fabricating things. This centrifuge is 100% 3D printed, and you can get the quality control with open source software that you can run on your cell phone. So if you have a cell phone and a 3D printer in the middle of nowhere, as long as you have access to electricity, you can manufacture yourself a lab-grade centrifuge and ensure that, when you're spilling down your blood samples or whatever you're doing, that you hit the right forces. Open source hardware has infiltrated many of the types of labs. My lab primarily did solar photovoltaic research, so we needed a lot of optics equipment. And a lot of the mechanical pieces for optics equipment get very pricey. That starts off for usually around $50, and you need dozens of them to make an actual optics setup. Optical rail runs $380 a meter, but you can get open beam for $12 a meter, and then you could 3D print all your fixtures for pennies rather than say buy them for $25 to $50. The overall sort of take-home message is that if you use this completely parametric open source optics library, you'll save between 97 and 99% on any kind of optics setup that you're putting together. You can also use the distributed manufacturing tools like 3D printers as scientific automation tools themselves. And so here's an example of using an upside down delta 3D printer for both mixing of chemicals and for fluid distribution. So this is like a 96 well plate that you'd normally have to pay a lot, like tens of thousands of dollars to have that automated. And now it's just a couple thousand. And so when we're seeing these large amounts of savings, particularly in open hardware for scientists, where you use distributed manufacturing, generally you save between 90 and 99% off of commercial proprietary tools. When I did a Fulbright Aalto University Distinguished Chair, one of the tasks I was set with was looking at all of Finland to say, should we strategically start to invest in open hardware development for tools that we're buying all the time or tools that we're importing from other countries or outside of Europe? Would it make any sense? What kind of money would we make? And so the kind of an exhausted study of what purchases Finnish researchers were making and which ones would make the most sense to open source, we found that if they were, even if they just did the bare minimum, they'd save almost 3 million euros a year. And if they got aggressive about it, it'd be closer to over like 28 million euros. Recently, there was some thinking that a lot of the easy open source stuff, like the pipette racks and stuff like that, had already been done, and were the technologies that we're developing now still seeing the same amount of savings. So last year, I did a review of all of the open hardware for science and found that the savings were 94% for free and open source tools in general over commercial equivalents, and if you used a substantial amount of 3D printing and open source electronics like an Arduino, the savings can be even higher. And so what we're finding is that the tools are becoming more and more sophisticated. And as they're becoming more sophisticated, they're going after the higher price point items. And from a national perspective, those are the ones that you would make the most sense to go after from funding. So you want to fund open hardware development rather than fund people just to purchase things. So to give an example of how powerful this can be, I consider the open source syringe pump library that we developed. And so this again was done in OpenSCAD. And so you can put any motor and any syringe combination together that you'd like in order to get the performance that you're looking for your particular application. And we ran it off of a Raspberry Pi, so you can also do this, off of Wi-Fi off the web. And more sophisticated versions like the one that Ville Klar did with force feedback, so you can start to use this not just for kind of base medical applications or electrospinning and chemistry, but also to do some real material science with it. And so because we developed this in my lab, I have all the economic numbers for it. And so it took about 30,000 US and with a 52% overhead to develop this open source syringe pump library. It replaces syringe pumps on the absolute lowest end at $150. The double pump, like the one I'm showing here, costs over $2,400 commercially. In the first month, it was downloaded 1,000 times. So the downloaded substitution value on the very low end after only a month was $168,000, which is far more than we invested in putting it for the overall scientific community. And if we go on the high end, over $2.5 million. Since that time, this particular design has been downloaded more than 10,000 times. And so I can conservatively say we've saved the scientific community $20 million. Now, if you are a funder of science, this is absolutely one of the highest return on investments you're going to get. And the numbers get silly. You're going to be well over 1,000% return on investment. If your goal is to push science forward as fast as possible, you want to make low cost open source tools that other people can replicate and start to kind of, stand on the shoulders of giants, take the thing that they just read about in the latest journal and start to be able to do it themselves. So to give you a feel for what this actually looks like, I have this cartoon. And so this is using US numbers as an example. So in the US, the two biggest funders are the National Science Foundation and the NIH, both of whom have kind of success rates under 10%. The last time I looked at the NSF one, it was like 7%. So if you submit a grant, your chances of winning it are only 7%. So let's say you're a science funder, a big one, and you're putting $1 million into some sort of technology, and you have two choices of the way to go. You can use the standard model where you would pay, say, $100,000 a year for 10 years to buy scientists' equipment, or you could use the open source model. So in the first year, both models look about the same. Only one scientist out of 10 is funded, And that scientist has to be a pretty, an older gentleman usually that has substantial experience in the field, has built up a large number of papers in order to have an H-index high enough that you're even going to consider funding them. And so you make one person happy, but everybody else loses. Where open source really starts to shine is in year 2 through 10. And so if the first year, the open source person that won the contract did a good job and made the open source hardware available to everyone, that second year, because we know at the very most it's going to be 10% for the cost to actually buy the materials to build the hardware, you could fund everybody that applies for the grant. And so no matter what we're talking about, no matter how sophisticated the tool, after you funded the open hardware development of it, you could start to provide it to all of your grant, everybody that's applying for a grant. Whereas in the proprietary model, every year you're only funding one person. And so in the open hardware model, because you could fund them and maybe fund them to improve upon the design, that's what the little stars represent, that you're getting better and better equipment over time. And so if we add this all up, in the proprietary model, after 10 years, you've only funded 10 scientists, and most of them have now outdated, unuseful equipment. If you think about how fast science is moving now, to have a tool that's 8 years old is probably unacceptable. 90% of your scientists remain unfunded. Where in the open hardware model, you get a huge return on investment, over 809,000%. 91% of your scientists have equipment that you funded them for, and all of those research tools are easily upgradable, only for the cost of materials. And so they're much more likely to be the latest and greatest, the state of the art. And so if we start thinking about how can we encourage open source, both on the software and the hardware side within academia. And so an idea I had was to start thinking about making open source endowed chairs. And so the typical terms for an endowed chair is you just have to demonstrate excellence in your field, you become a really big fancy person, and they give you an endowed chair. But an open source endowed chair would have two more requirements. That requirement would be that everything that you do must be made open access. So all of your writing, you write a paper, you make an open access version available, or you publish it in an open access journal. And the second one is that you release all your intellectual contributions into the public domain or under open source licenses. And for some academics, that might sound extreme, but the kind of the beauty of this is that you're getting the endowed chair. So it comes with a lot of prestige, and it also may come with something interesting. So I ran 2 surveys, one in Canada and one in the US, with this idea of open source endowed chairs, and sent electronic surveys to many of my colleagues. And so the results are in. So within Canadian faculty, 81% of the people that responded were willing to accept an open source endowed professorship. 34%, more than a third of Canadian faculty members would take the endowed chair with nothing else. They would be willing to publish all their work open access and put all of their technical work in the public domain or with open source licenses without giving them a single penny. The majority of them, though, wanted the normal things that come with an endowed chair. And so they would want about a third wanted graduate assistants to be paid for, and about half wanted a discretionary budget. And so the results that we can get from this kind of little mini study is that there's a huge widespread sentiment in favor of knowledge sharing within academia, within Canada, and that an open endowed professorship might be one effective way to catalyze and increase sharing in this community that's kind of already prepped for it. And you might be thinking to yourself, sure, this is Canada. They're known for being nice people. Maybe, they're already pre-primed for open source. Well, what about, the Americans, which maybe don't have that same kind of national characteristic of what they're known for? But interestingly enough, the numbers come out even slightly better in the American case. So there's a super majority, about almost 87%, would be willing to accept an open source endowed professorship, and only 13% were unwilling under any circumstances. And so you have 13% of these hardcore people that maybe think that they're going to become rich by getting patents and selling their technology to a VC. This generally doesn't happen. Of all the people that I interviewed and everyone that I've ever talked to, I don't know a single professor that funds his or her own research with money that comes from patents that they've developed at a university. Not a single one. You might know one or two. If you are, please send them my way. I'm very interested to talk to them to see how they did it. In general, that is simply not an economic way to make money as a professor. What the results of this US study show is that there's a willing, even in American academia, to expand open access to science. They want to have science progress at a faster rate. That's kind of following along the open source developmental platform. And from a funder's perspective, there is a large opportunity to move towards open science by funding open source endowed chairs. Something that we just have started at Western University in the engineering department is to start to also fund students to develop open source hardware projects. And so the idea behind this fund is that if an engineering student has a good idea and they would like to take it to the next step, but often engineers or often students of all kinds don't have a lot of excess capital. They're spending a lot on tuition. They don't really have necessarily time to work with their studies. And so what this does is provide a small amount of money that gets them started so that they can make a prototype and to see if the idea has any legs. And so this just started, so I don't have any data yet on whether or not this is going to be successful, but of the students that I've shared it with so far, they are certainly energetic and enthusiastic about it. And so to summarize, the opportunities to maximize the return on investment for research funding is obviously all publicly funded science should be open access. There should be open access mandates, and that can happen at the national and even at the university level. And we're starting to see more and more funders start to move in this direction, that now I think this is becoming the default. And so we've kind of won on the open access front. A lot of faculty members still aren't actively sharing their open access articles, even when they're required to. You can see this kind of in the shaming that Google Scholar does on your personal profile. The other kind of obvious thing to do, the next step, would be if we're funding science with our tax dollars, not only should we be able to read the science, but we should be able to use it. And that means that all software that's developed using public funds should be freely available to everyone, and that all hardware developed should be freely available to everyone. I think something that not everybody appreciates is that, especially for patents, there is no clause that allows you to use it unless you've paid for it. So if I patent something, you can't use it. You can't do science on it. You can't do research on it. You have to get a license for me even to make it. And so that kind of flies in the face of, we're dumping millions of dollars into trying to move science forward. And yet we're allowing individual researchers to patent, or their universities to patent the ideas and not allow anyone else to get to it. And so this is at both the national and the funder level. Lastly is strategic investment. And so we should start to invest public research funds for science into developing open source technologies, whether software or hardware, that are in the best interest of the nation. We should start to fund open source development. This can be at the university, the funders, and the national level. And then finally, we should think about funding open source endowed chairs. And so I'll leave you with this. Everything that my group does is at appropedia.org/FAST. We're the free, appropriate, sustainable technology research group. If you're interested in anything that I've ever done, you can get it there. And so I've essentially done what I'm talking about, is get a funded endowed chair to do open source research. Speaking of which, if any of you are a little younger and looking for a fully funded PhD to do open source development, particularly on the technology side, please drop me an email. We'd be happy to talk to you.
Wow, thank you very much. I think I have to echo Jan, who wrote mind-blowing. I can only agree.